we have the creation of magma, which eventually finds itself onto the surface of the Earth, which produces initially submarine volcanoes and then produces islands. And this process has been going on for millions of years, and we expect it to continue going on. It means, therefore, that if you live on any of these islands, these volcanic islands, not all of the volcanoes we think can erupt, but at least 11 of them do. It means that at some point in time, from time to time, at the very least, you may feel earthquakes that would certainly get you concerned. So you have periods of elevated seismic activity. But sometimes you can move from the earthquakes to actually eruptive activity. And the eruptive activity can be, steaming, phreatic outbursts from the volcano, or at worst, it can be magmatic outbursts. And because of the nature of the plate tectonic environment that we have, our kind of volcanism is particularly noted for being explosive. And in particular, for producing these events that we call pyroclastic density currents, which are some of the most hazardous kinds of events that can happen from volcanism anywhere in the world. So it means that we live in a region which, by its very nature of its formation, has within it the capacity to produce kinds of hazardous events that would impact very negatively on populations, on people, on structures that are close by, but even more so in the context of the region that are outside the territorial boundaries of any individual island. So it's a regional hazard as well as a local hazard.
Right, so let me pick up on Prof. Because these events happen relatively infrequently, maybe we do not have a sense of what kinds of losses are associated or have been associated with these events over time. Can you give us a quick snapshot of that?
Well, in the past 200 years, we have had about 30,000 people being killed. In fact, in the period since volcanism have been a problem in the world, the Caribbean, and in particular, Montpellier eruption of 1902, is noted to be one of the ones that have killed the most people. In addition to that, we have approximately 1 million people who are threatened directly by the impacts of the volcanic activity. That is, when the volcano erupts, it can touch these people in a negative way directly. In addition to that, within the region, we have about 2.5 million people who can be affected indirectly by the impacts of the volcanism, either because of the ash going into areas or, for example, evacuation and things like that. So it means that a substantial amount of the population in the region can be affected negatively, both in terms of potential for loss of life, but even more so for loss of structures, infrastructure, and by extension, their livelihoods. So the impact potentially is quite significant.
Right, so this question then, I will ask Dr. Joseph to join you and respond to this question. And it is, how has the improvements in science and technology help us to better understand this hazard, the volcanic hazard, which from what you said is very ever present in our community? And how are we using that science to inform or seek to inform behavior and decision making?
So I would kind of use two broad categories in responding to that question. One, in terms of the advancement, is in relation to our monitorings and operations. So with the advancement and equipment available, the sensitivity of these instruments, the robustness. So in terms of course, we're deploying instrumentation in a tropical environment. Often, of course, the terrain is rugged. We have seasonal storms, hurricanes, and so on. So in terms of the advancement in the actual equipment themselves, the sensitivity and the robustness, they help us to keep the networks functioning. That's one aspect of things. And of course, once the network is functioning, we are able to provide monitoring. In addition to which, along the lines of science, there are always new techniques and types of monitoring that can be done. And we, through a collaboration with external partners, we often try our best to utilize some of these techniques in the region, to better understand the systems, and then to be able to, once we, there's better understanding of the systems, then we're able to interpret its behavior and communicate that effectively, which leads into the second aspect is, in terms of the improvements and the advancement, it's in terms of communications itself. So as you know, with the event of social media in all its forms, and the ability for us to use this medium to provide outreach, not just to stakeholders and the public, but to engage a wider range of to expand our network, such that we try to engage the public sector, as well as the private sector, um, and other civil society groups, to help spread the information and communicate the needs to prepare for and how they can prepare for these hazards. This is how I would, in a nutshell, kind of summarize how advancements in science and has helped us with respect to helping to prepare um, our stakeholders for volcanic hazards.
Yes. Prof. Richardson, you want to add anything to that?
In summary, that compared to where we were 70 years ago, I would say it's more like chalk and cheese in terms of both the techniques that we utilize, the instruments itself, and the different kinds of techniques that's used to assess what the volcano is doing, but also in terms of the products that have been created. So in terms of the advice we provide because of these techniques and this knowledge that we have, in terms of the maps that we produce hazard maps of a kind of nature, of a complexity that it was really very, very much different than it was in the past. But also in terms of our advancement and understanding of what the volcanic systems are doing. The science have advanced significantly. In 70 years ago, the scientists had not understood the connection between, for example, earthquakes and volcanic activity. In fact, the historical name of Seismic Research Unit, the name came from the fact that we were set up to monitor earthquakes. And when it was realized, in fact, we were called the Volcanological Research Department first because we were looking at volcanoes. But then when the realization that earthquakes were fundamental in that, we changed to Seismic Research Center. So the way in which we monitor volcanoes, the way in which we understand or understanding of them completely, and also by extension the advice and the information we can provide, both in terms of information that will go to the public, but also importantly information that goes to disaster managers who have to manage the crisis, and even in terms of long-term planning, that has changed significantly, and therefore we are in much more better position to enable governments, to enable authorities to get the knowledge and the information they need to plan properly. I'll say finally, and maybe this might go on, is that I think, to me personally, someone working in the region for the years, I think there is to a large extent insufficient utilization of this scientific information, and maybe that's something we could talk about at some point. Thank you.
Yes, it's a very important part of the conversation, I'm sure. And fortunately, we have with us Kerry Hinds, who is the Director of Emergency Management in Barbados. And she participated in your volcano conference in St. Vincent last week, in which you were targeting this science and information for application. And maybe I could ask her, Kerry, on that day one, what did you learn about the volcano experience and hazard in the Caribbean that would inform your role and function as the emergency manager in Barbados?
First, let me say thanks for having me on today. With respect to being a part of the knowledge transfer that occurred last week in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I think it was important for us as disaster managers to have a situational awareness of the hazard that we live with, the volcanic hazard, particularly while we do not have an active volcano in Barbados. we did have the impact of the ash. And I thought it was particularly good to have that collaboration and discussion with the scientists, so we understood the whole genesis of the hazard and what it entails, and to understand a bit better in terms of the risk that it poses to the populations, not only on the island of St. Vincent, but also to the neighboring islands. And as Dr. Robertson would have said, it is a regional hazard that we are dealing with. And 2021 really brought that to the fore. So it was very important for me as an emergency manager to understand the hazard and the risk that we're dealing with, but also to kind of consolidate that information to see how best we can communicate that information to the public. It is important for us as emergency managers not only to utilize the information given to us to assist with decision making at the technical, operational, as well as at the political level, to recommend various actions or possible policies to the policy actions to the political directorate. But it is also important, I think, for us to ensure that we have the information available to us to communicate to the public, so that they can act accordingly.
Great. So really this brings to the forefront the issue of capacity building and the sustainability of the professional services to continue to monitor and support the understanding of the hazard. And so my question to the director of the Seismic Research Center is, what are we doing, or how well are we doing in building and sustaining the capacity to carry on the work and sustain the work of Professor Robertson and yourself?
So, as Ms. Hinds just pointed out, this is a regional effort, and it requires a regional responsibility by contributing territories to ensure that not only are agencies such as us, we're equipped to do the jobs, but that we do, which is to provide, this public service, but also to be able to serve the public and provide the warnings to them in order to help with the disaster risk reduction in the region. Given that the challenge the priority now is being in the region is being seen as climate change, and we need to be we need to integrate or be able to integrate the volcanic hazard aspect and the seismic hazard aspect, the georisk, into the climate change action efforts.
Let me scope the question, Dr. Joseph. What is this Seismic Research Center doing to ensure that we are developing the competencies and the skill sets in the region to sustain this work of monitoring and educating? Let me phrase it that way. Could you just focus in on that aspect of the question?
Sure. So we, in terms of human capacity, we have expertise here in as well as in other islands, both St. Vincent and Montserrat and so on. So we invest heavily into human resource capacity, which is training the next generation to be able to provide in geosciences, so that they can then lead that effort and continue that effort moving forward. We work with our partners in disaster risk reduction to also help keep that effort moving in many different directions by reaching out into different sectors of the communities and in the region with various stakeholders. And the other aspect of that would be, um, you said, in terms of sustainability, um, trying to work with external partners to provide funding for activities that are not supported by our recurrent budget. I
Right.
hope that.
So, Prof, I was reflecting in my mind as I was asking the question, and it dawned on me that you were engaged in this thing for almost 40 years. Are you satisfied that we are building the cadre of persons who will continue to robustly understand and promote the hazard, the important part of focus in this region?
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. And I'm glad you brought me in because I had a number of things to say. I think Seismic as an institution have tried consistently to do precisely that. So that's why, for example, we have a core internship program. That's why we now have gotten ourselves to the stage where we can actually do a degree program in volcanology and seismology, both at master's level MPhil and by research. We have 2 research degrees. So there are practical things we have done institutionally to help that. But also, the fact is, and frankly, is that the challenge fundamentally we have is the challenge of resources. I know we live in a region where you have limited resources. And unfortunately, Seismic as an institution that is monitoring a hazard that has a long interval between impacts of it directly is one that suffers from that. So therefore, one of the things that we constantly struggle to get really is resources to do the fundamental monitoring, but also to advance the science in the way in which we would like it to advance, and also to ensure that we have that cadre you speak about. So we have over the years deliberately tried to get young people and younger people engaging in science, either through our outreach program, through the core internship program, or through degree programs. But there's a limit to which we can really move further than that, because we're constantly then limited by our capacity to actually push these programs. So, for example, the core internship program is a 2-month program that we fund internally through various ways. There's no funding in our budget to do half of the things that we do, and that's a challenge.
So let me probe you here for a minute, Richie. Are you suggesting that the member countries of the Seismic Research Unit are not funding the SRC as intended? Is that what you are suggesting, or am I misunderstanding what you're insinuating?
Jeremy, I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it plainly.
It wasn't clear to me, so I'm glad for making that point.
So I'll say, frankly, there are some that are extremely good and have been consistently good. But in my experience, what you have discovered is that the ones who are particularly good tend to respond to an event. So, for example, prior to the 1995 onset of the 1995 eruption in Montserrat, to be frank, Montserrat was one of our most delinquent countries. St. Vincent to a certain extent, my home country, prior to the 2020 eruption, it was here and there sometimes. Now it's very consistent. So it goes back to my point that because of the fact that these events don't happen very frequently, governments and people who fund us tend to look at the immediacy of the funding based on the immediacy of the threat. And that's unfortunate, because I was saying about the science, about the fact that we have now reached the stage in the science where we can actually utilize a lot of the knowledge that Seismic has gained in volcanic hazards to project long term. I think at present it's being used a lot for short term, so by emergency departments to prepare volcanic emergency plans and things like that. That's good, but I think there is a need to utilize the knowledge for more long term sort of land use planning. That's not being used as much, perhaps because we don't have enough, God forbid, volcanoes erupting. And because we don't, therefore, the immediacy of making sure that every year you contribute to seismic is less on the island's part. I think it's unfortunate, despite the fact that you had an eruption in 2020, which clearly show that A, we could respond, and B, there is a need to ensure that you have an agency that can respond, that despite this, we are still, to a large extent, in the state where the governments who committed to produce, to contribute a certain amount, are not doing it, and therefore it means that the director of Seismic, Dr. Joseph, I empathize with her, I was a director once, constantly have to find ways of essentially, working a budget that is insufficient in the first place, and secondly, it's even worse so because the contributions that are due are not coming when it should, or are not coming sufficiently. It's ridiculous, frankly.
So let me pose another side of the conversation, is about how the science is being used, and you alluded to that earlier. And you indicated that now you have much more refined mapping and understanding of the hazards and the potential disruption that could cause in places. And so I go back to the Montserrat experience that you referred to. When the capital city, Plymouth, was dismantled by Hurricane Hugo, and it was rebuilt when there was existing information showing that it was at very high risk to the volcano hazard. So my question to you is, how many other countries, are there a number of other countries in this region who may have similar exposure and are being silent or indifferent to it?
I don't know enough about their response to say whether they are silent, but there is one or two countries that are in similar positions, and there is one that is in exactly the same position. The capital of Dominica, Roseau, is smack in the middle of where most of the volcanoes that can erupt in the future is. Now, the extent to which they're utilizing that in terms of their long-term planning, I don't know enough about that to say. But a cursory glance suggests to me that generally the region is not making completely and fully use of that kind of information that we know. In other words, in terms of long-term, where the hazards are likely to impact. I see it again, I refer to my own country, where the red zone within the last 40 years have had developments in it, which to a certain extent, in hindsight, they should have considered to move a little bit further south. I'm not a politician, so I can't say what makes people and the leaders take certain decisions, but I think it would be useful, and I think it's something that we ourselves as scientists have to make a great effort to do, and I think we are trying to do that in Seismic, to try to make and produce products to the authorities that they can see and they can use to inform their long-term planning. It really is not sufficiently used for all kinds of reasons, and I think in the end it's going to come back to bite quite a few of them, and a few of us.
So you're raising a very big question about the nature of our articulation and promotion of the resilient development and the resilient state, which we understand is risk-informed. And so I am taking away that what is evident from the volcanic hazard may be present elsewhere. So let me ask Kerry Hinds a question in relation to the 2021 event. Barbados was significantly impacted by the outfall. Now, tell us what you learned from that event, what issues it triggered, and what future actions you are proposing to incorporate the lessons learned from that event.
Okay, with respect to Barbados, there were a number of lessons which we would have learned from the 2021 eruption and the impact it had. There was considerable ash that fell in Barbados. For us and for a large segment of the population, this was something very new. And it prompted us, I thought we were very reactive in terms, yes, we would have had the information from Seismic, we were monitoring all along. We had the information from the Barbados Met Service and the CIMH in terms of the fact that the dust plume was coming towards us. But when the impact actually happened and what ensued after, for us it was very new and it prompted a number of actions. First and foremost, it was important to keep the public abreast of the situation and what was happening, and ensuring that we pushed out a lot of precautionary tips, what they should and should not do. Because at the core, the lives are important, human health and well-being was very important. Another area that we focused in on, the immediate actions, was the whole question of the damage assessment and needs analysis. What impact did the ash fall have on Barbados in terms of our infrastructure, in terms of our services, and also in terms of the wider impact on the various sectors, whether it be tourism, energy, those type of things. Those were the types of conversations that we had at that time. Immediate and long-term impacts, whether it be structural impacts or even the economic impacts as well on Barbados. The whole question of the ash cleanup, that was one that was very foremost. This event occurred in April, and it was just on the cusp of our Atlantic hurricane season. And it was important for us to ensure that we stored, disposed, and cleaned up that ash, because we were thinking forward in terms of what may be the repercussions of having all the ash on the ground, and what scientists had said to us would be a very active hurricane season. In terms of the economic cost of the ash, what it is that we had to do in terms of all the measures that we had to take to ensure that we cleaned up the country. As I said, it was very novel to us. We had to reach out to countries that had that experience before. We had to look at the case studies, that type of thing, but all in a condensed operational time frame. Also, the whole question of the collaboration, trying to seek and obtain possible support from regional and international sources, because while eyes were on the actual eruption in St. Vincent, I think the whole question of the immense ashfall that we had, the communities, the regional and international communities needed to be made aware of the impact of that secondary hazard. And also the flexibility of the system, ensuring that the system is one that really has an appreciation for the multiple hazards that we face and the complexity. Remember, we were in a COVID environment.
Great point. So let me transition to this key issue of the volcano erupted during a pandemic event, and what implications that have for decision making about evacuation. So, Prof. Robertson, you were very involved in helping to inform the policy thinking about the evacuation considerations. And I've always felt that this has something very much to do with the relationship and the trust in the scientists and the political interface. Can you tell us what that experience was like, watching the science and helping to brace a decision on evacuation in an environment in which COVID was also present?
Jeremy, I say it was extremely challenging, and I think St. Vincent and the authorities, both the disaster management and the government authorities, did well to manage the situation. It was challenging, as you know, because the fundamental thing that COVID did was restrict movement, and one of the things that are done on the early onset of a volcanic eruption is educating and informing the people, telling them, having meetings, making sure that they understand what could happen and what should not happen and things like that, apart from putting plans in place internally in the organization, both at NEMO and at the other agencies that have to respond. And that was particularly challenging because you couldn't have the kinds of interaction that you would have wanted to have. So the authorities, NEMO, had to come up with innovative ways of reaching out to people, of making sure that they had the people aware and informed about what kind of actions they need to take. So that, I was therefore able to, we were engaged in some new activities that I'd never done before, which was quite interesting. I think the other thing to note is that to be able to manage the crisis in the way in which it's done is something that requires the development on a long term of a certain kind of trusting relationship. And I think, fortunately, at the time in St. Vincent, St. Vincent was one of the places that Seismic traditionally had spent a lot of time in, and that they had a regular and very close interaction between Seismic scientists, including myself, and the authorities there. So there was a certain working, trusting relationship that developed that enabled us to communicate in a kind of way that it might have been more difficult to do if we didn't have that kind of relationship. So I think the authorities were able to sort of allow us to do what we needed to do, and then hear us and understood what we were saying when we provided the advice. The challenge that you had and they had was to make sure then the communication with the people who had to respond and had to do certain things was then put in place. So it wasn't perfect, but I think in the conditions, it really, to a large extent, is a test case in terms of how you develop and cultivate meaningful relationships between the disaster management community and the scientific monitoring agency, and then utilizing that very effectively in terms of managing a crisis.
So the question that I will raise, and I will invite all the panelists to contribute as they see appropriate, and starting with Dr. Joseph. Are we seeing any opportunities to revisit how we promote the development of volcanic-related plans, given the multi-hazard nature in which these may now occur? Was that considered before? And if it wasn't, what are we anticipating may need to change about how we promote the thinking for volcanic hazard in a volcanic hazard in a multi-hazard environment?
As I was mentioning before, with climate change becoming more of a, I don't want to say push in the region, but push, we need to integrate the georisks more into this multi-hazard planning in the region within that framework, so that resources are put in place to try to cater for this multi-hazard environment that we face. So that's one way in looking at long-term planning that will help provide resources to cover these, the nature of the hazards in the region. So that's one thing that I would suggest. Certainly, the resourcing, as I mentioned before, recognizing the need to, by the government, by the authorities, to invest in these, in the monitoring of these hazards, and the agencies that do the monitoring, so that we can provide the advice that is necessary and provide them with the services required to keep the public informed. So these are the two main things I would kind of encourage.
I will go to Kerry and then come back to Prof. So Kerry, as an emergency management professional, what would you have learned from the 21 events, including the volcano, about what needs to change in disaster management planning at the national level to reflect the potential of simultaneous or concurrent hazards?
I think at the national level, we have to reflect a bit more on the complexity, dealing with a number of hazards at any one particular time. And 2021, I thought, brought that out, really emphasized the need for that. There are a number of opportunities. I see in terms of the communication of the risks and the hazards, after 2021, I must say, when we reflected from the end of the Department of Emergency Management, we quickly tried to put in place a pervasive program to help educate the populace about the hazard. We're actually right now in our what we call our Volcanic Hazard Awareness Week. And we reach out, and this has been a long-term arrangement that we have had with Seismic Research Center, where we invite them to be a part of the week of activities to help us educate the population, because that in itself is very important to us as emergency managers, because we need to ensure that the public has the information available to them to make the right type of decisions, really to essentially save their lives if needs be. As well, the issue of scenario planning. What 2021 brought out to us, we really needed to go back to the table and expand our minds in terms of the types of scenarios that we face as an emergency management system. And that will help with the development and validation of our plans and procedures. It will also help with building the capacity of our emergency responders, and not just persons within the emergency management office, but the wider national system. I know persons would have spoken to the whole question of the use of technology. The incorporation of technology, the incorporation of knowing that we were in the backdrop of COVID, operating in an environment where we may not necessarily be the traditional face-to-face in an EOC, but utilizing the technology and knowing that we had to utilize the virtual space to collaborate and make the relevant decisions. I think it is very important that we support, we look at the whole question of the data capture, analysis and visualization, and that is why I would put a plug here for supporting the Seismic Research Center in terms of ensuring that we are a part of a system where there is predictable and sustainable financing for our regional entities like the Seismic Research Center, because it's important for us to have that baseline information, that evidence that will support our planning and support the wider long-term resilient development that we talk so much about. And I think what this is an opportunity for is to find ways where we can program, whether by ensuring that it is included in our work programs as the emergency management or the wider system, to ensure that we have collaborative opportunities included, so that we can advance what we're doing here in terms of trying to build that level of resilience. The workshop last week in St. Vincent, to my mind, is something that we should see if we can ensure that that is a normalized activity. It can spread around the region, because the reality is we are in a seismically active region. We are in a region where we're affected by the volcanic hazard, whether we are living with the actual volcano on our island or we are recipients of the ash and other hazards from the volcano. And it is important for us as a region that we ensure that we utilize these opportunities to expand our knowledge and to really ensure that the populace, decision makers, the technocrats, persons at the political level understand the implications of living with these types of hazards and what we need to do within the space collectively to ensure that we manage the hazards.
Right, there's one question here which I'll read, and I suspect it will be directed at Professor Robertson or Dr. Joseph. Good day, now joining, but an update on La Soufrière. A picture showed a crack in the lake at the summit. I'm not sure what picture and what time. What does it indicate with regard to the volcano? Is it a natural phenomenon of the volcanic activity? Richard, Dr. Joseph?
I could respond and Richie can as well.
Well,
So you want to go first, Richie?
Yeah, I know of the picture that the person referred to. It's a picture of mud cracks in the lake, which I posted, and I have since explained what it actually means. It simply means that the lake is drying out when the dry season, so the lake will dry out, and because it's muddy, fine silt material up there, it will develop these cracks. I took the picture more as a picturesque, kind of nice picture, and of course people are very concerned about volcanoes, so they pick up on the cracks and ask questions. So we've tried to respond to it. Volcano is quiet. There's nothing to worry about that.
but that really raises the question about how are we engaging in communities in understanding and in monitoring of these volcanoes. What is the actual experience like, and what are the benefits and the lessons being learned from that exercise?
So I definitely believe that certainly in recent times, within the last 4 to 5 years, we have engaged in a number of citizen science. The general word that was used to kind of convey the involvement of citizens and communities in the work that we do was kind of roughly coined as citizen science. So we have engaged in a number of projects and activities in several islands, including St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and even Trinidad, in projects that are community related, where we work with the members of communities and certain civil society groups to either collect monitoring data, to train them in like first aid and response, community response, and to also enable them, such as the citizen seismologists, to provide data for the felt reports to us that we use in understanding the impacts, to better understand the impacts of events in the region. So that's one of the ways in which we've used the engagement of communities and citizens to kind of help advance science. Richie, you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you very much, Pat. So I'll add to that, and I'll mention something about what you asked before. Yes, Jeremy, I think within the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years, Seismic has realized that to make a fundamental change in a lot of what happens in the islands in the context of volcanic hazards, we have to engage more closely at the community level. In the past, we have engaged mainly with the disaster management community, and through them with the public, and through them with school kids. We were mainly focused on educating and outreaching to people in primary and secondary schools. As we move forward, and certainly within the last 5 years, we have moved towards engaging more at the community, at the village level, finding ways in which we could have projects that involves working with them, either to educate them, to inform them, or else to outfit them with tools, techniques, and also work with them in developing community maps in terms of them being much more aware of the environment, of the hazards that they're exposed to, and helping us also in doing that, in collecting some data. So I go back to a project we had in St. Vincent a couple of years ago, and it actually continued during the eruption, called the Volcano Ready Communities Project. That was sort of the first big engagement in that regard. And in speaking of that, I then want to refer to what you mentioned before. I think in the context of multi-hazard environment, I think in a region where we have small island developing states, I like to suggest that we think of them in the context of volcanic small island developing states. And this is a term which colleagues of mine, collaborators, have looked at, and looked at the fact that in volcanic islands, they have some unique characteristics which are related to the very nature of the volcanism itself, which particularly in tropical environments make them prone to multi-hazard. So that when we did the Volcano Ready project, we actually contextualize it in terms of not just the volcanic hazard, but a volcanic environment which is hazardous because both the volcano can erupt, but also because the volcano creates steep slopes that could move, and you can have landslides and flooding. And also the volcano is in a tropical environment, so you have the hydromet coming in. So I think as we move forward in the context of the focus on climate change in the region, we need to put that spin on how we approach the problem. We are in small islands which are fundamentally driven by this process of volcanism, and because of the nature of the process, it's going to cause us to have to interact and be affected by climate change in a particular kind of way. So we can't, as we prepare for climate change, ignore the volcanic hazard, because that's fundamental, in a sense, to the kind of hazards that we're exposed to. We have steep slopes, we have loose material created by volcanism, and because of that, we then are going to be exposed in a particular way. So I'm saying that in moving forward to looking at volcanic hazard and couching it in the context of the multi-hazard environment, we need to look at it as a volcanic environment which, because of the volcanism, is exposed to multiple hazards. And we need to, in doing that, then engage with the communities who live on the islands, who live on the volcanoes, in a really serious way to outfit them with the tools and techniques, the knowledge, the resources that they need to make sensible decisions. And as we move forward, as much as we can do that. So I'd like to make one final plug for that replication of that Volcano Ready project that we got funding for in the other islands. You know, a number of other islands could benefit from that kind of engagement. And it would be related also to what Kerry said in terms of looking at maps and engaging with the community, with the disaster management community. That could be weeded into it. You need that kind of thing going forward. And really what is limiting that is not so much that Seismic technically can't do it. What is limiting that is our ability to have the funding to replicate it in the region.
So this is a repeated call for more resourcing of the efforts to understand and apply volcanic hazard information within the region. And I'm hearing also the need to support activities such as community type mapping and that ready to go. And maybe this is an opportunity for the private sector to partner with governments and the science to improve this kind of information sharing. And it brings me back to one point that Kerry raised about the opportunity for that road show where you're engaging the local communities about the hazards and the impacts on what they could do, as was done last week in St. Vincent, where we had a significant participation of the persons doing that exercise. So there is one thing I want to kind of gel in on before we move towards closure. And we've spoken almost about the volcano as a physical thing. We've spoken almost indirectly. But is the Research Unit Center facilitating undertaking or promoting some assessment of the social impacts of the volcanic eruptions and the demands, for example, for social protection services, etc. Is that being part of what you're now promoting to start the bridging of the integrating into the national system?
So I could start and then Richie could add to that. So yes, for example, there are two things. One, post-eruption in St. Vincent, we did do an evaluation of our communication. It was post-eruption, obviously, of our communication efforts on island with a range of stakeholders. So we went in and did surveys of different sectors of the community to engage them about how well we communicated about the hazards and what was required to help improve on our communications on island. In addition to that, from our experience in St. Vincent, we actually took that to move on to Dominica, which, as Prof. Robertson indicated, is another island where there is significant volcanic risk, and we needed to start working on improving that effort there. And we recently did a needs assessment quite similar to what's being done, or from the information that we learned from our St. Vincent experience, to engage with a number of stakeholders on that needs assessment to see what could be done to improve our communications with all levels of the public, including the, as you indicated, the private sector, to try to help move that effort forward in terms of improving resilience and community preparedness. Richie?
Yes, thanks, Pat. As Dr. Joseph said, we have a couple of there were two kinds. One was, as she indicated, the evaluation of our impact in terms of outreach, and those were, I guess you could think of it as seismic, trying to determine how best we can do the communication that we're doing. But there are a couple of research projects with which we're engaged, which involves interaction with the community. So that we have a project that we have with various colleagues in the UK, which we call the Changing Landscapes Project, which has involved the creative space, using creatives in St. Vincent to interact with the community in the areas affected from the volcano, to make them more aware of their landscapes. And in a sense, what we have done through the project, and we've realized through the interaction, is actually allowed them to speak of their experience, to express their experience in a way that they weren't provided with. Last year we had a huge exhibition in which they produced, which they created. They had collected photographs, and they had a photographic exhibition in which they had the whole community come together. It was a whole sort of sharing experience. And we moved on from that and now teaching them how to do and having them involved in doing documentary film. Those kinds of things, unfortunately, even though we can push them as much as we can, the issue is to really get the collaboration we need and the funding we need to do it. It's currently done as a research project, but to do it sort of in a sustained way requires us to interact more with other people in other fields, because we don't have, Seismic don't have social scientists and people like that in our affairs. So we have to do collaborative projects. And as much as we can, we have been trying to do that, but it really depends on us having persons who are also interested. I think there is a need for that to be done in a more probably proactive way within the communities itself. And I think as much as it can be done, I think islands which have been affected by hazards, they really need within the island to think of how they can provide a space for people to, communicate that experience, a kind of a way in which people can exorcise their demons from that experience. And that's something that can be done internally. As much as we can, we will try to push that interaction with the community that not just involves providing them with information, but through our interaction with them, learning from them.
Right, thanks. I'm going to give Kerry a minute to kind of rain on this question of community engagement and community resilience. And then I'm going to come back and give you all a chance to wrap up on your personal professional experiences from the recent events, and in particular the volcano eruption. Kerry?
The whole focus on community engagement and community resilience to these various hazards is a major focus of the work program, not only in Barbados, but I think across the region. That is a core aspect of the whole comprehensive disaster management strategy and framework. The opportunities that are available to us, I think we need to ensure that we capitalize and leverage. There's a space for that level of collaboration with various entities. And as I reflect on what we have done thus far over the years with the various entities like Seismic Research Center, donors, SEDEMA, those type of organizations, the ingredients are there for us to advance the whole efforts, specifically as it relates now to the volcanic hazards. The whole issue of community profiling, engaging the community so that we have the information that we need in terms of risk, in terms of vulnerability, the data sets that we need to really ensure that we make the appropriate decisions, not only at the level of the community, but at the level of the responders, the emergency management community, and even at the higher levels. So it is very important that we engage the community in that data capture, the analysis, and even the visualization of that information to promote early action, to promote proper planning for these types of events, and to understand the vulnerabilities of the community. I think it is also important that we continue to have sustained public awareness and education programs. And we need to ensure that we understand the at-risk population, we give them the information that they need to make the appropriate actions, but we do it in innovative ways. Because the populations, the community is made up of a diverse amount of actors, and it is very important. We always have to keep in the back of our minds innovation. What will make a 3, 4, or 5-year-old think a bit more about the hazards that we face? What will make a 13 to 15-year-old so, and what will keep the older persons within the community engaged? Over the years, we have looked for innovative ways to capture the attention of the community, so that is not only when an event has occurred that they are aware of what is on, because the idea is to come from a stance of being reactive to being proactive in terms of how we incorporate living with hazards as a part of our everyday lives.
Beautiful. Beautifully well said. So I am almost beginning to think that there's an opportunity for a conversation with the community on these hazards and volcanoes. I'm throwing it out there for the organizers to think about it. And so I want you to take this opportunity to, based on these conversations and your experiences in 2021 and therearound, and that multi-hazard event, talk about some of the professional lessons and personal lessons that you identified, and how you want to see these roll out into action. So let me start. I was trying to get the gender thing worked out, so let me start. Let me start with Kerry again. I'll give you 1 minute, and then I'll go to Richie, and then I go to the director of the Seismic Research Center, and then I will give a wrap up.
The experiences of 2021, the last couple of years, and even as we bring it into the present, shows us there is an opportunity to really, there are opportunities for us to advance as a region, to really achieve that resilient development that we're looking for. The whole question of the resource mobilization, that's very important. And I think from all of our various perspectives, there's an opportunity for us to pool our resources and to really leverage resources not only available to us in the local space, but also in the regional and international space, to carry forward the efforts and to build on the efforts of this region. Community resilience, the importance of always keeping at the forefront. We're doing this for every individual within the community, and we are not doing it for them. We have to do it with them. And that's the only way that we are going to achieve our goal. And in terms of, as an emergency manager and the National Emergency Management System, the importance of the flexibility of the system to understand that, and for us to understand the changes, and for us to ensure that we put the necessary planning and the necessary capacity enhancement in place within our various work programs.
Beautiful. Richie, your minute.
Yes, thank you very much, Jeremy. I'd just like to endorse what Kerry said and move on from off of that. Say that yes, community engagement is one of the things that I think the experience of the last since 2021 has shown me is key in terms of ensuring that populations can live safely with volcanoes in the region, which they can. So as much as we can push towards that and work with communities, I think that's something that even agencies like ourselves, Seismic, who operate mainly in the monitoring and science field, I think that's something that they need to do. And as much as we can find ways in which we can fund interactions that would ensure that communities get the information and the knowledge that they need, that would be great. The other thing I'd like to say is that it's clear that we have knowledge and capacity within the region to manage hazards like volcanoes, to manage them effectively. I think we need to now put in place that knowledge more effectively for long-term planning to ensure that in the future we don't build and increase our exposure to these hazards. As much as we can do that, I think we can live sustainably with volcanic hazards in the region.
Thank you very much. Dr. Joseph?
Yeah, so I think we're all singing from the same hymn book. In terms of with the events of 2021, we had just gone through a transition in directorship here from Professor Robertson to myself. And with the volcano in St. Vincent erupting, it really meant that we had to rely on each other and the expertise of the various staff members, both those based in Trinidad as well as at the Montserrat Volcano Observatory, to collaborate with each other and to engage with each other at a more closer level, or to monitor the volcano and to provide the advice that was needed to the authorities. In addition to that, we did have the problem of funding agencies and other external response agencies not seeing the effusive eruption as being a hazard or a problem until it transitioned to an explosive eruption. And honestly, I thought we were past that given our past experience in the region. An effusive eruption is still an eruption, and although at the time it began and it was confined to the crater, it was still an eruption and preparation was still necessary before it became explosive, not after or when it was about to. And this led to the long-term partnerships in the region and the importance of that.
Thank you very much. I think we had what I call an enriching initial conversation. This needs to continue. What has emerged from this is that whilst there has been some significant advance in the science and the understanding of the hazard, and the better able to articulate that risk and its spatial distribution, there has been, relatively speaking, a slow uptake in the application of that knowledge and that information in the development and decision making in these threats at risk. In fact, I am even understanding from these conversations that there is an indifference in some places to the realities of the volcanic risk in some parts of this region. And that's a major challenge that has to be overcome at the highest levels. What is also clear is that more investment needs to be made in the engagement and understanding of the social estimates through more community engagement. A deep underlying thread emerging through these conversations was the adequacy of resourcing, either both from the state level, from other sources. And I'm seeing here a great opportunity for building some partnerships with different elements of the private sector. And that is something that you may want to think about. But the big question for me that I thought was posed needs to be really considered as we promote the agenda of resilient development. It is that our resilience is not only determined by the hydromet hazards, and that especially in the Eastern Caribbean, these seismic hazards are equally relevant and must need more attention. And therefore, the science-informed and evidence-based considerations and how we promote our development needs to be more rigorously examined and considered in that process. So, Professor Richard Robertson, Kerry, Hinds, and Dr. Erouscilla Joseph, I want to thank you all for this conversation about the advancement in science and its use in resilient development in the Caribbean. Thank you all for listening and participating. I am